If you're interested, the books are for sale here. I'm extremely happy to have Dan, who's been a business journalist in Japan for
way too long. No, I'm kidding.
Who covered the Meiji Restoration.
It went pretty well.
It went pretty well, yes. Even though we remember your story on Murder, it was very good.
I got beat on the black ships, but everything else.
We interviewed the last shogun, and it's not only about the future, it will tell us how Nintendo played to win. There's no free gaming console here, but there are books. And really, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Dan. We'll speak for about 30 minutes or something like that, and then we'll have our usual Q&A session. If there's too much noise out there, we will ask the students to keep quiet, but this is a university, we cannot. This is not a retirement home. We have noisy residents, but I'm sure you'll out-noise them.
Okay,
thanks again, Dan.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you all for coming. I'm really, it sounds like an AA meeting. I'm a first-time book writer. No, I'm really honored to have you here tonight. It is my first book, and it's something that we'll talk perhaps later about the book writing process itself. But more or less, this is something that was not my traditional beat. I'm a business journalist, and I have looked at pretty much nearly every industry, not every company, but most of the more famous companies in Japan, and certainly was familiar with Nintendo. But as kind of a disclaimer before we begin, I'm not a video game enthusiast. That hopefully doesn't come across in the book, but essentially this is a story that I think kind of supersedes any sense of whether you followed it or not. It's tremendous situation when a company that was 120 years old basically decides to go in a new direction on the cusp of almost becoming an industry also-ran. We've got a video that kind of, hopefully, reasonably quickly would encapsulate where they were in the year 2000. But I think, most of you are old enough to either have had some exposure to the Game Boy, or even before that, this Famicom, Super Famicom, the Nintendo Entertainment Systems or Super Entertainment Systems. But what went on in the last decade, for which I think everybody here is quite familiar, were two incredibly successful products, but rather unusual products relative to what the industry had been doing. And you always hear in business the talk about thinking outside the box, but Nintendo was really a company that had always done its own thing and really eschewed any kind of sense of being part of the video game industry or even having peers. And we'll talk more about that as the night goes on, but let's try the video. The audio sadly doesn't work, but this is from about the year, you probably want to turn on the lights just so everyone can see it. This is from around the year 2000, and yeah, go ahead. And this is one of the various, there are, this is my Howard Cosell imitation, not very good. No, what happened was the video and the audio don't sync, but what was going on here was in the year 2000, actually 2001, Nintendo had just launched something called the GameCube. And I don't know if any of you had this. It was a TV monitor linked console. That's it. It had previously come up with something called a Nintendo 64. Both of these were hoped to be the successful successors to their earlier NES and Super NES, but neither achieved the results they wanted, and ultimately the GameCube proved to be the worst selling console that they ever made. At the same time, all of this is going on, and they had lost the mantle of #1 to Sony, who had been extremely successful with the PlayStation, and more or less kind of inundating the market with cheap software, Nintendo was trying, and Sega had been trying, to kind of play a game of faster, stronger, more bells and whistles for our consoles. And what had happened pretty much every 3 or 4 years, the processing power of the respective consoles had doubled, the CPU power. But this was not, for Nintendo anyway, getting them a larger audience or bringing in more revenues. And they were in a really tough spot. Sony, by the turn of the around the millennium change, had 70% of the market. Xbox or Microsoft had just come into the picture, and Sega was leaving. Sega had decided that, thank you very much, but we've looked at where we are, and we'll just make software from now on. Some were suggesting, to Nintendo, that they should take the same strategy. They could live off, as all of you know, the iconic characters that they have, Mario, Pokemon, Zelda, etc., and that would be enough, plus making software that they could get out of the hardware game. That would be something that they would absolutely and adamantly refuse to do. This is kind of interesting relative to where we are right now, and as the gentleman you just saw was the then tapped new president. He was all of 42 years old. His predecessor, Hiroshi Yamauchi, had been president for over 50 years. He was the 3rd generation of Yamauchi to lead the company. It began in Kyoto in 1889 as a card-playing company, and slowly, and painfully sometimes, migrated towards video games. But in 2001 and 2002, the company kind of looked at very deep existential questions and made the decision that its future lied not only with Satoru Iwata and a very well appreciated gaming design team, notably led by Shigeru Miyamoto, but really there was a legacy console that was about to be handed off, which would become the DS, or the dual-screen handheld console. So, all of this was something that the industry itself really got caught flat-footed. The industry being those companies that weren't Nintendo. They were playing a game that, if you wanted to be successful, you needed more processing power. You needed video. The Wii obviously has a different arrangement than its predecessors, but if you look at, say, the PS2, the PlayStation 2, things were getting, we want to bring in more kind of video. We want to bring in all the things that are out there for the respective intent of owning the home entertainment system. Nintendo was a little less ambitious than its counterparts in this regard, and ultimately won the day, at least over the last decade, by taking that tack. And we'll talk a little bit more about that right now. You just leave it. Anyway, again, just to come back to where we were in the year 2001 and 2001, where the book begins, all of these issues are going on, and you have the succession question, because you have a 74-year-old CEO. He is a really crafty businessman, ornery businessman, who's never kind of endured or tolerated his competitors or any sense that he was not the visionary for the industry. And Nintendo had a rocket rise from the 1970s. As Atari and other kind of firms that had created the industry were taking off, Nintendo kind of got into it backwards via a deal with Magnavox and bad businesses that Yamauchi had been in. He had tried I think, instant ramen, and then he had tried bowling alleys, and love hotels, and taxi business. And eventually, none of these were really providing the 20th century answer to where Nintendo as an entertainment company was supposed to go. And he slowly, via the genius of a guy named Gunpei Yokoi, got into games initially, and then eventually games as a facet of video games. And they started kind of a laser shooting gallery, first in the bowling alleys, and then brought towards, they licensed the Magnavox kind of technology for Japan, and this then slowly beget their own games division, and ultimately, in the early 80s, brought on a young man named Miyamoto, who was initially designed or hired to kind of repaint old arcade machines, and one of the games that he was asked to retool, at that point it was Popeye, but he took the version of Popeye and made it into Donkey Kong, and obviously a global hit that took off exponentially. Anyway, a lot of that I think you probably know. To kind of push it forward though, as the industry was having big issues, literally the video game industry was crashing and burning in the 80s. Nintendo took off first with the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the Famicom, and then in 1989 they came up, Yokoi came out with his kind of legendary Game Boy, which was arguably, up until the DS, the greatest console in terms of total sales and revenues. They went to the top very quickly as the rest of the industry disappeared. Then you get to the 1990s, where maybe the hubris kind of set in. There was a book, and to some degree there hasn't been much of a telling since 1993 of the Nintendo story, but that book is titled, and it's very well written, it's called Game Over. And more or less it declared that Nintendo had won. And what happened over the course of the next 6 to 7 years is that first Sega and then ultimately Sony ate its lunch, and the company lost its way. So what the company was facing at the time of that, not only the succession issue, but also in terms of what kind of products were going to enlarge the market, excuse me, were huge. These questions were out there, and really they had not, they had not suffered financially during the 90s. Pokemon was brought on board and made tremendous revenues for them, but they endured their first loss shortly after naming Iwata as president. And they also were getting these questions about, do you really want to make hardware? What's the point? Which was quite interesting, because their whole company, and Iwata said very clearly, the day that we don't make hardware is the day we give up. We're done. And what they had designed with the DS and the software in particular that they were coming out with was something that would widely change the market as it had been known, the definition of gaming and the definition of gamers. I think many of you probably know the DS, which debuted in 2004. It was kind of those in the industry thought, what is this? And it had kind of the different kind of screens that you could look at, but it also had a tremendous variety of games that were trying to change the demographic of gaming. Things, some of you may have experienced them, be it Nintendo Dogs, or be it the brain training games. They were trying to bring in more people to an audience that was more or less, for them, had been kind of limited to pre-teens, more or less. The people that were core gamers had turned to Sony or Microsoft, who were making kind of consoles that had greater processing power, and ultimately games that serve that audience. Nintendo, all of this is going on, and Nintendo was kind of seen, there's a bit in the book that points to a Wired article that was written about 2003 and 2004 and looks at Miyamoto in particular. And this is a guy who was, he's widely seen as almost the Orson Welles of game design. A genius who created narratives and beautiful backgrounds, and initially working within extremely limited resources to create games, he had suddenly, he expanded what everyone could do to not only make but play games and ultimately consoles as well. And all of this, in 2003, after the failure of the GameCube, was kind of coming onto him and onto his door and all of Nintendo. So it was a real question of, what are you going to do for me lately? And he came out, or rather Nintendo as a team came out with something that was a profoundly engaging product for the times and for getting more people to take a punt on gaming. The games that I mentioned, it's quite interesting. In 2004, the day that the DS debuted in Japan, Iwata actually went up to Tohoku University to meet with the professor there, who had written a book about brain training that was quite popular in Japan. And people thought, well, what are you doing? We're trying to sell consoles today. What are you doing going? And it's a fascinating, within the book, you can see or read more distinctly what that experience was like, but it was incredibly profitable relative to where Nintendo had to go. And it was all more or less dictated by a board member, a Nintendo board member, who said, why don't older people play games? And they thought about it. In a normal company, that at a board meeting is not where you come up with like software or designs or suggestions, but it was something that then obviously played a part in thinking about the Wii. Again, with an intention, and Iwata calls it, and others, the blue ocean theory of putting your fishing line down where nobody else is fishing. This they did with tremendous success. I think, I'm giving you the numbers as best I recall, but for the DS has sold over 130 million consoles since 2004. That's more than twice as many as the closest competitor, which would be Sony's PlayStation Portable. And the Wii is probably about half that, if memory serves, but obviously has been the console for the last, or since 2006, that has done better than either of its rivals, the PlayStation 3 or the Xbox 360. The Wii, which is probably arguably the one that had engendered the greatest global interest, kind of took gaming to a new place. It had always been, if you were at home, a sit down, you're stuck, you're kind of almost on the couch, and it was not known as a healthy pastime in any regard. The Wii took that, by its untethered nature, to activities, again, a lot of this kickstarted by Miyamoto, that were intended to kind of get you to interact with your family, do things like, look, kind of yoking the popularity of yoga and other pastimes towards health. For, again, gaming had not been known as the healthiest pastime to take part in. So it was equally, it had a variety of kind of attractions to entice an audience. But really, if in retrospect you think about what people will always remember the Wii for, is that it had a kind of a literal disconnect for what gaming had been. It was something that it was mobile, but it was also still kind of a console or a monitor orientation, but it was interactive, it was active as well, and something that ultimately was fun. And I should have prefaced all of these remarks going back to 1889 and the card-making roots of Nintendo, in that the whole company's ethos from day one has been, it's got to be fun. You know, this company began making playing cards after a 250-year ban on playing cards. And you know, initially its popularity, or the Hanafuda popularity, was with gangsters. But eventually, after going beyond Hanafuda, it went to playing cards in general in Japan. And probably the first and most successful thing that Hiroshi Yamauchi ever did was he inked a deal with Disney in the early 50s to get the Disney characters on the playing cards. And if you think about it, you know, all of these ultimately play out in Nintendo's kind of game strategy. Iconic characters, you know, Mario, Pokemon, Zelda, whatever, and this concept of fun, entertainment. And that has been really the company's mantra since, be it from Gunpei Yokoi, Shigeru Miyamoto, even Yamauchi himself. So anyway, let me just bring you to next Saturday, where, if you don't know already, it's 10 years later, and now Nintendo kind of needs a next best thing. The industry, you know, has a usual cycle of 4 to 5 years. In some cases with the DS, they completely blew that out of the water by giving you a different version, iteration of the DS every 1 or 2 years. Started with the DS, DSi, DS Lite, DSLL, and now we're going to get this 3-dimensional console that's coming out on Saturday here in Japan. 4 million probably over the first month, likely sales of 20 million over the first year. They have kind of let's say, a must-have technology in a time that the industry itself is facing tremendous competition from cheap games and more or less smartphones. And if you're in the mobile space, you better have really good games or something, because those games that are on smartphones are free or $5 versus $40 to buy software for the 3DS or more, and a $250 console that will be required. So, you know, in 2003, Hiroshi Yamauchi said, after essentially passing the baton, that we won't go bankrupt if the DS isn't successful, but we will be in a very deep, dark place. Looking at the 3DS, they won't go bankrupt if the 3DS isn't successful, but they will be in a very tough situation if, for any reason, the numbers that they're talking about, not only the first year, but farther, 2 or 3 years down the road, are not sustained. And there's a lot of doubt about whether that demand or that the same kinds of enthusiasm that you saw with the Wii and earlier with the DS are going to be replicated this time around. There's lots of different competition, be it Sony, be it Apple, be it the relationships or things that smartphones can do, 3D phones and others. And that's only the handheld space. You know, they're also making, you know, there's a lot of demand and a lot of criticism that Nintendo should have already come up with a Wii 2 or whatever you want to call it, because right now, you know, the potential for the consoles, the bigger consoles, the monitor-linked consoles, is diminishing. And, you know, arguably, the manufacturers already recognize that. But, you know, in the sense of what Nintendo is going to do, they, you know, very obstinately will never stop making hardware. If you know, Sony just came out and debuted in, I think it was late January, their what's going to be called the next generation portable, the successor to the PSP. But at the same time they did that, they also said, oh, and by the way, we're actually going to allow our software to be played on other platforms. Now that's something Nintendo absolutely will not do. Because essentially it's saying, Okay, if you can't beat them, we'll join them. You know, if you want to play it on your smartphone, great. You just buy our, you know, you buy our games and play them on your platform, your choice. Now that's kind of very heavy-duty business speak. And I should get back to what's fun. You know, what Nintendo's mantra is that this is supposed to be fun. You know, it's not supposed to be about making money or businesses, albeit they are exceptionally profit-oriented. They don't make consoles at a loss from day one, like their competitors. They make them at a profit from day one. But I think many of you are here because you actually like what they make. You know, and that's a hugely important thing to think about this company. In the last decade, they sensed a need, they created a product, and it worked. And relative to many Japanese peers right now, it is, I think, even more a profound success story. So about, I don't know how deep I am in the evening, I think about 30 minutes. So I'll open the floor to questions, and you know, one thing I should say is every question is welcome. You know, there's a fair bit in this book about, you know, even the Seattle Mariners purchase by Nintendo of America and Yamauchi. So anything is fair game.
Good. So just not everybody knows everybody here, so when you ask a question, just introduce yourself.
Tasho Sudo, businessman. Thank you very much for the presentation. Let me give one of my awarenesses, and I'd like to ask you outlook or view. It's understandable that Nintendo is focusing on specific gadgets such as DS or Wii, and avoiding the competition of smartphone or PC-based games. At the same time, we could say that they have to give up the mass who prefer social network-based games, which is increasing its share recently. Do you think it's a wise decision, the strategy, or is that's all they can do, or
will they change? I guess. Yeah. No. Very good question. Nintendo has, you know, in Japanese, you'd almost say, excuse me, you would almost say they're a tad snobby. You know, whether it's a Kyoto thing or whatever, they're not a member of any industry organization. They have long kind of denied that they really have peers or competitors. We do what we do, they can do what they want to do. And you know, a lot of that I think it cascaded off of the Hiroshi Yamauchi approach to running a business. Whether it's something that's tenable to take into the 21st century remains to be seen. But if you really think about, you know, what's going on right now, it's the commoditization of those games. So social networking games, or you know, the cheap games on smartphones, it's a real element to erode the ability to charge $40 for a very manufactured but beautiful game. The people in the industry will call what they create, in the industry meaning they'll call them experiences. You know, that might be slightly elevated prose for, you know, what you get for $40. But what they are quite aware of and what they would like to emphasize is the difference between $5 or social networking games and $40 three-dimensional games. Most of what has happened over the last decade in terms of retailing for these major manufacturers is that all of them have the capability to do online business, right? They're selling everything they can, even back catalog stuff, online. You know, they're trying to circumvent having to lose anything towards, you know, going to a store. If we can sell it ourselves, that's great. But you know, I think your question is really, can Nintendo continue to kind of play that game and not have a social networking presence or anything else? I think part of the Wii, you know, this kind of interactive ability to play people in other places, and Xbox and Microsoft, everybody is doing the same thing, is an intent to create communities. You know, a community is a way, perhaps, to not make you think about the fact that there's cheaper games out there, you know, because you have a loyalty to this experience. You know, probably for right now, they believe that that's a tenable approach to continue. If they don't do well with the 3DS, maybe they've got to rethink that. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk.
If you could identify yourself.
Daryl Jenks with the State Department Language Institute in Yokohama. I wonder if you could comment a bit on the corporate culture at Nintendo. I mean, you said that it's got to be fun, but I wonder how that played out as you were writing the book, and how was your access to people?
Well, this is the part, it should be another disclaimer. This book was written without any assistance at all from Nintendo. Not that I didn't try. They have as kind of a standard response to any request in this regard that we don't, as a company policy, facilitate books. You know, I'm in the media, my colleagues are as well. There have been Nintendo interview opportunities over the years, and the book really takes everything that's been written with Nintendo's participation. They do have certain windows, I'll talk about just in a second, but everything that was appropriate to what was going on with the company, there's a public moment that I can take what they said and use in the book. But this is not an insider's book. You know, I'm not, you know, in the brain trust of Nintendo getting a sense of where they are spiritually. You know, anything that came is public somewhere. They've got something, and again, this company, and if anyone's from Nintendo tonight, great, glad to have you. But I really think, you know, this company has succeeded despite a really, and I'm not being abusive, a kind of antiquated public relations approach that, you know, it does not really feel the need to engage in a way that, you know, that kind of gives full access or disclosure. Nor do they have to. Hell, if you can make billions of dollars without, you know, having to do that, I'm sure, you know, you sleep okay. But one of the things that they've been doing of late that I think is part and parcel of the newer CEO, Satoru Iwata, is something called Iwata Asks. And I heartily recommend, if you're interested in the company, to read these, because it's a brilliant representation of who he is relative to his staff and the company's future. He's a very self-effacing, but incredibly engaged and kind of humorous guy who knows his company's story inside and out. And in many regards, he's the anti-Hiroshi Yamauchi, you know, who is kind of the old stern, you know, I get my way, don't argue with me, you know, we will prosper because you fear me. And in Iwata's case, I think he is someone who is from Hokkaido, not Kyoto. He's obviously not of Yamauchi stock. He did not originally start with Nintendo. He started with a stable company called HAL Laboratory. And slowly they made games for Nintendo. They did a good job. That company actually went bankrupt though, so he had experience with financial difficulty. And he more or less took the skills and the experiences that he had, you know, as a game designer in high school. This is really, you know, one of those where I always think the difference between me and them. He went to high school in Sapporo, and he was designing baseball games on his, you know, and that when you had those kind of handheld pocket calculators where you're doing sine and cosine things. You know, I always said, I was trying to like make curse words upside down, you know, 770E, you know, something. This guy's making baseball games, to which he can share with his friends. And I think about it, you know, and that kind of creative impetus was a big part of what got Hal off the ground, got him into Nintendo, and ultimately I think, imbues his staff with the belief that he not only knows what we're doing, he knows where we should go. So he, I think, amazingly, as astute a character judge as Yamauchi has proved to be, he easily could have been ridiculed if a 42-year-old guy comes in. The share price tanked when he came in, actually, because they thought, who is this guy? He's a kid. He's arguably a Yamauchi puppet, if anything. What is he going to take? How is he going to take the company to the next level? Well, obviously, Yamauchi's faith was proved well rewarded, and he has been a fantastic boss. At certain times, I think in 2008, various magazines have called him, or at that point, the best CEO in business. And the company's share price, conversely, soared, as you probably well know, to a level, at one point it was under 10,000 yen. It went over 70,000 yen, so a seven-fold increase. A lot of that was kind of manipulated. Funds get in, they drive it up, they drive it down, which they did in 2008 and 2009. But, very briefly, Hiroshi Yamauchi was Japan's wealthiest man. So, even from the money side, I think Yamauchi was very happy with his selection.
It's interesting, you pointed out that they tend to ignore public relations and that they don't belong to industry associations. Ulrike Schede, who gave a lecture at TUJ very recently, looked at Japan's most profitable companies, and what she found is that they don't spend time in industry associations, they don't spend time on government committees, they basically spend time on their business.
Making good kid, yeah. Well, that's not surprising, and there was an FT story in 2008 or 2009 about productivity, and it actually said on a per-person basis, 3,000, 4,000 employees, 3,000 I think when the book starts, 4,000 when it ends. Nobody, except for Goldman, actually more than Goldman Sachs, on a per-person basis they were making $1.4 million per employee. A lot of that was kind of accounting. They off-source some of their production, so it can't actually be seen as an employee, whereas they're still making product and selling it. But from a productivity perspective, they're a tremendous company. And the guys that you would think, there's a segment, blissfully, because Japan changed its disclosure laws about what the bosses make. In the last chapter, or the epilogue of the book, there's a segment where we find out that, I think all-inclusive, Iwata makes about a little over $3 million a year, all-inclusive. But relative to, let's say, Howard Stringer at Sony, it's about a third what Stringer, I think Stringer makes 6 to 7, maybe 8 million a year. But look at performance. Iwata, 25 years of tremendous success. He could have formed his own, his own software companies. I'm sure Microsoft or anyone else would have lured him with more money that they could, that could shake a stick at. He never left because it was all about a comfort, a creative liberty that he had at Nintendo, and throwaway. This is Miyamoto speaking. Let's get out of the way. Even Yamauchi, I think, very early on recognized that this guy was not the Messiah, but this guy really knew where gaming was going to go, and he could ride this horse to greater success.
Peter Beck with Council on Foreign Relations at Hitachi Fellow at Keio. I have 2 questions for you. I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail on the Yamaguchi family going to a professional leader for the company, because that's something that's very un-Japanese, it's very un-Korean for a family-owned or family-run company to do that, and how difficult was it for them to do that? And my second question is, what is your prognosis for the 3DS? I left my gaming years back when I was a teenager, but my kid is very much hooked on the DS, and it started with the Nintendo dogs. And I've been impressed with all of the just shoot 'em up games that they've come up with. My sense is that given that 3D hasn't really rocked the film world to my knowledge, I'm not sure it's going to rock the gaming world. But if there was a little chip, if I could pay $20 and have a Japanese English or Korean Japanese Korean English dictionary, they are issuing books. I just noticed that you can get 100 kids books or 100 great novels on one chip for $20. It seems like expanding the functionality and versatility of the device would yield more than the newest bells and whistles of 3D. But that's just my sense. I was wondering what you.
Yeah, no, two good questions. Let me make sure I don't miss the first one. So looking at where Yamauchi was, just some background. This was a family, let's say, the initial Shiro Yamauchi was an artisan who became an entrepreneur from Kyoto. The Osaka era, Kansai became his business realm. The family was kind of besieged by not having male heirs. So the son-in-law would marry into the family and take on the business line, as happens in Japan. So Hiroshi Yamauchi's grandfather, the son-in-law of Fujishiro, becomes the next boss and kind of leads it into the 20th century. And then, same thing, they didn't have a son. So another gentleman marries into the family, Hiroshi's father, and he, for whatever reason, he balks and he runs away from the family and leaves Hiroshi essentially without a father. The mother leaves as well, so he's raised by his grandparents. I mean, it's in the book, and it's kind of just back story, but it does figure into his kind of cold, let's say very not charitable, but just really dry approach to business. So he was known, he's a Go player, he was known as a really astute and quite exacting businessman, and he got great deals from his parts suppliers and great deals from the retailers, ultimately via NOA. But he had a son, but the son was kind of farther down the line. His son-in-law was a guy named Minoru Arakawa, who married his daughter Yoko. And Arakawa was really the guy who led the beachhead to America, North America, in the 1980s. So all of the Mario, Donkey Kong, Super Famicom, Game Boy, all of that success that really the United States provided billions of dollars of revenue was because of Arakawa and a guy named Howard Lincoln, who led Nintendo of America from that period through more or less the millennium. He was long seen, even by Miyamoto, as the guy, the normal, succession choice. But he wasn't really like Yamauchi, his father-in-law. And I think Yoko, his daughter, really didn't want him to be that guy. So, oddly, at around 2000, 2001, there's a kind of a very terse announcement that comes out and says, Arakawa is no longer on the Nintendo board. And he ultimately retires before Hiroshi Yamauchi. So what had been seen as the bet, even though Yamauchi never played his cards publicly, to say who's going to follow me, now was a complete wide open choice of what to do. So do we want to name the 60 or 70-year-old older guys on my board as the next generation? Or do we want to do something completely unorthodox relative to everything that history and Japanese tradition and so on suggests? And obviously he took the unorthodox approach. And the book has little segments in there where Iwata is talking about during this recruitment process. He said, Yamauchi would come up to him and kind of give him like Zen, parables. Like I said, You could be it if you want to be it, but you can run away from it if, you know, and it's all kind of playing with his mind. You know, I'm not going to tell you that you can do it. You know, he wouldn't come out and literally, you know, give him the tap on the shoulder until that, you know, I think, you know, as it comes across, Iwata is as surprised as everybody else. You know, were there other choices out there? Possibly, but, you know, Yamauchi's not talking, so I don't know. As to the 3DS, I mean, Sony in particular has thrown its cards in to some degree in its, let's say, its non-gaming sense as well, with the 3D technology being the kind of catalyst to get people to buy new TVs or cameras or whatever. So far, sales have not really proved that to be a very astute assessment. You can't argue with the success of Avatar, for one, or, you know, the billions that were thrown out towards seeing that movie, and that the industry, and be it sports or other things, are heading towards 3D delivery. But there's a very interesting segment at last year's game show. There was a guy, Phil Spencer, who works for Microsoft, was there, and I asked him, and I said, you know, do you really think 3D is going to be everything it's made out to be? And he said, you know, there's a shock. You know, people go, be it Avatar or whatever, there's a shock moment when you do it the first time. But once you've had enough spears thrown at you, or chairs thrown at you, or, you know, things popping up, it kind of wears off. And the question is, so what next? What else? We were chatting about, you know, what industries historically, you know, have made things like this work or successful. There's a lot of talk about sports, how delivery of certain sports in 3D will be a way to kind of engender consumer loyalty. As to gaming, I think people, you know, what the industry or consumers seem to want is something new. And this, you know, and something old. You can still play your old games on this. It's got something that you can play in 2D or 3D. But, you know, is that going to be enough? With the success of the smartphones and everything else, Nintendo has said publicly that telephony is not in our wheelhouse. But can you afford not to have a telephone or a great 3D console that can't make a call? You know, there are reasons, and they quite, you know, succinctly express why they don't want to be in that business yet. But, you know, maybe if certain things change, that would be a, you know, for your first 3D SI or something, that would be the first switch that would probably not surprise too many people.
John, you can take us off.
Sure. Brian Minahan, I'm with Sangaban. My question is related to how deep is their bench? You kind of answered this partially already, but the current new president, I forget his name,
Iwata,
is for their next big thing, their idea person. Is he like the Steve Jobs that, you know, as soon as he goes, the stock drops? What do you know about how deep their management team is that can develop the next best thing other than Iwata?
there was a book review in the UK that just kind of said, you know, and of course I'm hawking my own book here, but said this is what Apple should do. Basically, do something. You know, if there's any kind of claim to Apple's vulnerability right now, it's no bench. One of the, I think, the things from an IR perspective that the Iwata asks, you know, online discussions portray is how many smart people work in the company and how many other decision makers exist. You know, I don't know whether it's corporate, you know, a CEO's desire to not make, but it's an absolute sense, or in the interest of the company, to elevate other people to a position of prominence beyond your CEO. You don't want too many voices saying too many different things, But in the case of Nintendo, there is a core group of people that he does his chats with, but he's also talking to the software designers, these creative people who are coming up with the games. He's even talking to third-party suppliers. So people outside Nintendo. There's a long criticism of Nintendo that its focus is really proprietary software, not the other companies that make games for its kid. So, one of the things that I think Nintendo has been successful in is giving you different people, from a journalist perspective, to want to interview. The guy that was behind the 3DS is a different guy. He had been behind Nintendo Dogs, and I think he's the guy behind Nintendo Dogs and Cats now, and different things. But there's more than one name or one kind of driver. In the United States, the head of Nintendo of America is named Reggie Fils-Aimé, and I may be slightly mispronouncing his name, but basically, he's got the same kind of market throw weight that either Iwata or Miyamoto do, and he's an English speaker, and they they make public appearances and kind of with like a rock star type reception, but there is that linguistic thing that sometimes prevents mass opportunities or mass market opportunities. So I hope I answered your question, but essentially I think they don't want a replay of a 74-year-old guy in a quandary for who next.
I'm Justin Rixby. I'm an econ student here at TU today, and as we've seen, Nintendo goes about creating their own ideas for their systems. How do they tend to stay competitive or in the market when other companies incorporate those ideas? For example, the touchscreen controls are now on the iPhone in the next generation portable. The motion controls now, Microsoft and Sony have their own version. So what do you do when everybody else says anything you can do, we can do better?
I mean, I guess the first thing is you said, like when they came out with what was first called Natal and is now Connect, Microsoft, said, oh yeah, by the way, we actually looked at that technology 5 years ago and decided not to pursue it. So, they're not snobby, but they will not tolerate a comparison that they don't think is fair or appropriate relative to their experience. And it's up to the consumer to take trial 3 and see which you prefer. I think they are quite aware, and even the blue ocean strategy we were talking about. Iwata knew that once people see you pulling in nets full of fish, they're coming for your supply, and they were aware of that. The industry is kind of, it used to. I was saying earlier today, the 70s, more or less the 80s and the 90s, and the last decade, there's always been talk about the console wars, right? Who's winning the console wars? And I'll admit that that was kind of a way, an enticement to, if you have a winner, and in this case you kind of, the book Nothing Happens in a Vacuum, the chapters on Sony are, I think, pretty straightforward in the hardship, not just in the gaming industry, but across the board that Sony faced over the period and the extremely expensive and steep learning curve that Microsoft had. But I think, again, back to this, where we are in 2011, I think, the companies are kind of picking their niche versus wanting to go toe-to-toe on, hardware all the time. So if Microsoft is strong in their live service and they're profitable, which they had not been in anything else they had done prior to it, they had tremendous success with the Halo franchise and other things, but they found a way to make money. That was step one. Sony had been extremely profitable, hemorrhaged by playing the kind of too fast bells and whistles game, has kind of tried to come back within themselves, and I think what we're seeing with this idea that, okay, if we license you, you can use our soft on your phone. They're certainly modifying the way that they're playing the game, and the question is, really, is Nintendo got the kit to be able to continue in their traditional business model, and we'll see.
Yes.
Yeah. How does Nintendo control or enclose game creators? The reason I ask you the question is related to my first question, and which you have explained already. There are competitors which distribute the opportunity for them to make cheap games easily, and young, motivated creators who do not have capital are incentivized to go into that industry first. So, on the other hand, what Nintendo is doing to make high quality games which will offer a great experience to users, but it seems tough and it needs certain initial investment for game creators to create games.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a conundrum, because obviously you want to incubate next generation talent without kind of completely saying, oh, it's low end and we're not interested. And Nintendo, if anything, has focused perhaps too much on its proprietary game creation, less with these relationships with others. And obviously HAL's success, or HAL Laboratory's success and Iwata's success is an example that you could be outside the company as a supplier, and actually that relationship would blossom. I don't know, literally it would be great to talk, with Iwata and kind of get a sense. There was a recent Iwata Ask with a Texas-based, I believe, game creator that was doing something. But these weren't young guys. This was an established studio. I can't speak honestly on this question of whether they are nurturing future talent. At various times in the book, there's a Yamauchi thing where he comes up with I think it was called Fun Q or something like this. It would have been around 2002, where he flopped a bunch of money at this idea of a startup academy for games. No interest loans. You can go into it, get something created, and then we'll talk to you. But I should also note that this was a real period of desperation for Nintendo. They really, after the failure of the GameCube, they needed something good from outside, and probably were more willing at that point to pay for it than perhaps they are now with the stable of their own hits.
Yuki-san, I'm presenting Turkish Center Bank here in Tokyo. I want to bring this example to a macroeconomic framework. Japan is facing a huge debt stock, unprecedented debt stock, not experienced before, but have these companies can go bust and reborn again, resurrective companies. Is it possible for these companies to extend the sustainability of high-level debt stock for another decade or more, just because of their resurrective power?
I don't know if this question is really applicable to Nintendo. It has always, it actually posted a debt within the last year, a loss, I should say, but it doesn't run at a debt. They have a war chest of billions of dollars. Mm-hmm. This really was like a Yamauchi credo. In fact, if anything, this kind of supposed parting of the ways between he and his son-in-law was built on the fact that NOA had built up some debt, or one of the reasons. I think Nintendo is not, they do things kind of the old-fashioned way, pay for it by cash, start from day one, making money when you make a product, not necessarily built on hopes of future returns, or more or less, let's say, the internet or Silicon Valley model. But relative to what is going on for other corporates in Japan, I really think they're a separate bird. It's hard to kind of compare their experience or their business model with what others do.
What, you mentioned that the American operations have a lot of autonomy with the head of the US office, is a very important manager there. To what extent is Nintendo globalized? I mean, is the management here entirely Japanese? Do they have foreigners in management here in Japan? Where are the young managers trained, educated?
You know, as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, so I do not think they have, even Reggie is not on the board. I mean, I could be wrong. He is obviously head of NOA. Howard Lincoln was a lawyer who ultimately led the company and was replaced Hiroshi Yamauchi's son-in-law as boss. I don't think they have necessarily any kind of disinterest in having greater foreign, management participation, but to some degree it's been ceded to the provinces, the places where they're selling the kit, whereas the Nintendo headquarters is, again, it's a rather tight company. You cannot get into Nintendo headquarters on your own. There's no showroom there. There's nothing to kind of let you get in and suss out exactly what the makeup is internally of it. But I think it's traditionally been a Japanese company, at least in Nintendo and their factories in Uji and other places. And I don't think that approach has hurt them. They make kit overseas, in China and elsewhere. They've got businesses in every place they can put their fingers. But I think the leadership elements of those of those entities are primarily driven towards the sales, not the kind of overall leadership.
And how does one join Nintendo? Is it like joining a large Japanese company? You have to go to one of the top universities and interview after. I mean, how do they recruit their managerial staff?
I can only go by the guys that that join. I mean, the kind of case histories of those. I'm going to take Miyamoto for example. Miyamoto actually was introduced to the company, I think, by his father's friend who knew Yamauchi. But he was not, he went to I think it was Kanazawa University. This was not Kyodai, this was not, Ritsumeikan. This was not one of the top universities of Japan. But he got his shokai, he got in. The others, pretty much across the board, if memory serves, Iwata went to a Tokyo Science University, a very kind of prestigious school. I can't remember the name off the top. Another guy, Genyo Takeda, did go to a very good school, and some of the other senior leadership had, but most of these guys were talking 30 years or 40 years ago went to university. I don't know what their recruitment is like now. I do know their remuneration relative to their peers is considered quite high. Not obviously for the senior leadership as I was detailing before, but if you work for Nintendo, according to the Nikkei, you make the best bonus in Japan for a company. Yeah.
It's Scott Foster from BNP Paribas. Even Samsung has issued warnings about the potential effect of looking at 3D images too much. And game users, particularly kids, that
you mean warnings in terms of your financial health? Or?
Dizziness.
Okay.
Problems affecting your vision, health risks.
Okay.
And this is, well, many people have talked about this, but even the companies that make these products and are trying to push them onto the market, like Samsung, are mentioning the potential health risks. Now, Nintendo users, particularly kids, tend to be addicted. They stare into these things for hours and hours at a time, even on a sunny day. Are you worried, or is Nintendo worried?
They came out with a warning already.
Yeah, well, a warning, but a warning is one thing. Are you worried, or are they worried about a class action type problem?
When they came out with this warning, it basically says children under 6 should not use the 3D function, right?
Under 6, so people start playing
So,
video games.
that's exactly the response I had. I said,
do they also say the elderly above 95?
this is like my ignorance of who plays games, right? I thought, under 6? Well, who's letting their kids play games under 6? Apparently, lots of people. And so, you know, again, I just kind of completely, and it blew my mind. Okay, so what are they doing? Like 3 years old, they got a game going? Or, you know, I have no idea. But, you know, to be kind of counterintuitive about what that warning ultimately says, some said that it was just a kind of a way to remind everyone that it had 2D and 3D functionality. So with the slider, you can go back to 2D, and you can play your games in 2D. And also, they wanted to kind of imbue the need for parental oversight. You know, they don't, you know, it's something that constantly comes back to this company, you know, be it, you know, family play or, you know, ways to monitor how much usage has gone on. They do want parents to own what their kids are doing and not to have class action lawsuits and not to be said, oh, you know, you're, and it's not just that, you know, there's a small bit in the book about how they were different from their peers in terms of the games they made. You know, initially in the early, excuse me, in the early part of the last decade, and 90s as well, they were criticized as making preteen games, kiddie games. You know, everybody else is doing, you know, car games and gun chases and, you know, shoot 'em ups, and, you know, they're kind of doing a guy jumping on mushrooms. It was not seen as perhaps the an astute way to get a larger audience by playing it soft. But on the other hand, parents had confidence. Ultimately, you know, that confidence meant, you know, what are we going to buy at Christmas time? We're going to buy the game we know is not going to leave our kid messed up. So anyway, back to your question. You know, 3D may have deleterious effects, you know, and then they'll end up coming across in different ways. But I think right now it's a sales pitch with a, you know, a very strong software product line that's going to be attached for Nintendo. You know, their key is that you play without glasses, whereas if you're buying a TV, with the exception of Toshiba, you're wearing glasses.
Is that slider to 2D a unique selling feature of Nintendo?
Sure, yeah.
That's they're pushing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other manufacturers, you know, Microsoft, Sony, are making 3D games, but you have to wear the glasses, right? So you can't play that 3D game and take off your glasses because it's looks like you know, a bad science project.
To follow on my previous question, globalization, in terms of the games, do you have to adjust them for different cultures? I mean, do they have people who write the games? I mean, how do you figure out, you know, I mean, I would assume that, you know, maybe what Korean game players like is slightly different from what's popular in South Africa, what works in Brazil, doesn't necessarily work in Finland. How does one do this?
Okay, you know, and here's where I have to defer to the people that are gamers, and go to other countries and play, because, I mean, it's amazing, shocking to me, that basically Nintendo had no product for Korea until the DS. You know, Korea, and if anyone knows better than I, please tell me, is a very, you know, very online country, but very into online games, not into what had been kind of Nintendo's strong suits of console-based games. So the DS and their kind of marketing pitch was something that, you know, they hoped to be successful. But the issue of localization is one that is constantly, for certain countries, going to go to loggerheads with Nintendo's approach. They want complete control. You know, the localization thing, if you're in Korea, and one of the reasons they've had problems is that Koreans want to play other games on their Nintendo kit. And as soon as they do that, or they re-engineer it, or backwards engineer it to get it to work, Nintendo will disown the product if it's brought in or there has any problems. So, I mean, that's, I don't think directly answering your question, but really it's a company that has been focused on an English-speaking audience and a Japanese-speaking audience. It had, or has a business in China, but what it was selling in China was kind of a warmed over old console 8 years after it had originally been out. So it wants to sell everywhere, but it's going to do it by its own rules.
Yeah.
What is the role of the game show in all of this? How does Nintendo use that? And what can we expect from the next one that's coming up?
Well, there are lots of different global gaming events. And as I think I was trying to say in the beginning, Nintendo is notorious for not taking part. At least the one in Japan, the Tokyo Game Show. It did not last fall. It usually has its own kind of event. And it did, I believe, in January this year, more or less to preview the 3DS. It does take part in the biggest industry show, which is called E3. It's in Los Angeles. It's usually about April or May. And there's an event coming up in the Bay Area, I think at the end of this month, that Iwata is the keynote speaker. So it's not necessarily avoiding the industry, but again, I think it wants its own spotlight if at all possible. And I mean, this is a very subjective opinion, but I really believe a lot of this is going to change when Hiroshi Yamauchi dies. He's still alive. And I think at that moment, it's not like the heavens open up and Nintendo changes its pace from the next day. But I really think it will be an opportunity to kind of pursue a more open and in the ways that they've been successful in some of their online promotions, be it Iwata or other things, to get out there and be more hands-on. And maybe market conditions will force that if they don't, again, sell well.
Yes.
Jay Deffelbaum, stock analyst. One of the industries that I looked at is gaming. And actually, if I could supplement your previous answer, the reason why Nintendo, 95% of their revenues come from these three major markets is because of piracy. It's a razor blades thing. They're not going to kill themselves to sell hardware when they're not going to sell software. But my question for you is, I think one of the fascinating parts of this industry is the balance that is needed in each company. You have the crazy developer side and the management, the bean counter side. And I'd love to hear your assessment on how Nintendo is able to pull it off. A lot of the companies, you get the prisoners running the prison kind of situation.
Yeah, it's amazing, all of the early era, the Ataris and others, crashed and burned. And from the ashes of that, and why a lot of people say Nintendo saved the industry, is they actually came out with games, software, and consoles, and helped to reestablish its retail or retailers' confidence in gaming as a sales entity. In the 90s, I think the competition became even more intense. The prices go up. Nominally, more people come to gaming by 96, 97, at least in Japan, and ultimately in those other markets. But Nintendo, I think, varied from day one, and really maybe a Yamauchi thing, is that constant profit model. Even there's a segment in here with Miyamoto where he's talking about a film studio, or rather, even Yamauchi kind of said maybe they had the Pokemon franchise to begin with, right? They've made some Pokemon movies and made money on it. But the next question is, Disney had a studio. It just kind of makes sense that if you've got that entity already, you could easily dovetail it with longer production things that potentially, with branding and all kinds of revenue potential. And I really believe that they itemize exactly what the potential return would be relative to, or return on investment would be towards, flopping a few or $100 million at it. And there's a segment where Nintendo, this is a guy who's preached the mantra of fun, and he's saying, essentially, the answer in the book is, we've looked at motion picture production, and it's not something we want to entertain. You know, this is the guy who's preaching fun and he's talking like a bean counter. And he normally doesn't. And I really think, and Iwata is absolutely part of this as well, it's fun, but it's a business. And they will not, kind of, they'll take a punt. Certainly they took a punt over the last decade at various times. But not something where they haven't sussed it out. And I really think that's their fear as far as telephony. You know, it is a revenue stream that they can't necessarily control or kind of lay out in terms of how it's going to play over a 2 to 5 year period for revenues. If they could control it, and it is a rather manipulative company, then I think maybe they would go there a little faster. I don't know if I fully answer your question, and relative to, you can only just say the wrecks on the highway of the last decade. You looked at specifically Sony, and there are chapters on it in the book, and the amount of money, Microsoft dropped $400 million on the Xbox to start. Really didn't get a profit off going into gaming until 2009. You could say it was a multi-billion-dollar branding exercise. Sony had been very profitable and got too deep into a number of bad businesses, but its gaming, like Microsoft, was on the back foot, where instead of going bigger, brighter, faster, stronger, it was kind of fun and not necessarily more expensive fun. And obviously lost out terribly with PS3. So, that nobody's broke. I mean, it's still Sony and Microsoft. They had a significant war chest to be able to endure that. But the actual gaming industry itself, the software makers, as you're portraying, there's a lot of pain in the industry, and you don't necessarily, it's not necessarily a great industry to invest in or to be part of. The social gaming, you were asking about, incredibly lucrative, because you get somebody in there. The Silicon Valley money is pitched at it reasonably early. It takes off. It becomes popular, and Zigna and others have made it.
Two questions from your answer. One, what drove Atari and the others into the ground?
Okay, another book, but not mine. No,
I mean,
again,
the lesson from it.
There's a book. I mean, again, it's Game Over has this in there, and there's another book about that Stephen Kent wrote about the history of games, and they were like your version of Silicon Valley cowboys, only in the gaming industry. And I mean, it was a lot of characters, and pride and kind of over ambition, or rather faulty premises about what the industry could do, putting money into different, taking some of the gaming money and putting in other industries that don't return. It's not part of this book at all, but ultimately they stopped selling games, and or they stopped producing software that were compelling games to keep the sales going.
And the second question I think is, you very often emphasize that Nintendo likes control of everything. Is it very much like Apple? I mean, what defines Apple is also control from hardware, software, distribution, applications. Is there a similar DNA in both companies?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the Yamauchi era, I mean, initially a lot of their financial success purportedly was because of these exceptionally exacting deals he would get out of the suppliers, Ricoh and some of the others. He would buy chips in bulk, deals that they were happy to get the business, but ultimately it didn't really make them a lot of money, but it allowed them to make their kit at a lower overhead. I think they're tough. They laugh at themselves, but they definitely see it as a business. It's not. You always hear the Osaka business mentality kind of thing, and they're from Kyoto. But I definitely think they they are quite strong entrepreneurs and businessmen, along with being very creative.
Other questions? Okay. Here.
Nintendo have a tie-in in the
If you
U.S.
could introduce yourself.
Steve Bingham, I'm a personal friend of Dan's actually, live in the neighborhood. Yeah, Nintendo have a tie-in with Netflix in the U.S. How's that going? Any ideas?
Everybody does, actually. You know, the new wave, be it the live services, Microsoft, I think, was the first. So, I think Sony's got one, and maybe even Nintendo was the last. There was a CNBC interview with Reggie Fils-Aimé, you can see online. After that's done, and I believe the Netflix president was part of it. You know, they want, you know, for them it seems like a no-brainer. You know, if you can show it, make revenue off of it, and not really have to change, you know, what your kid is already, and the same thing for the other two. You know, it makes great sense, and you know, if you go back to like the PSP, you know, this idea when they first came out, they thought, well, we're going to beat the DS, or we're going to own the handheld space because we can see movies on our handheld. But in fact, as it turned out, as the PSP comes out, the memory, you know, required and the battery, you know, strength to be able to actually watch, you know, you get a 2-hour and 13-minute movie and you've run out of batteries at 2 hours. So, you know, it's something that, you know, for them, I think all of the major players, i.e. the big three, are thinking about those relationships that they can, you know, kind of cement. It's across all kinds of sports provision. I think is something Nintendo's very big on right now, be it for the new console or the Wii. You know, trying to tie up ways to deliver new experiences that don't necessarily force them to make a new console. So, again, I mean, have you watched a movie on your Wii?
Good quality.
Yeah.
Friends use it, and amazing selection, and yeah, it's been a good experience.
And you know, if memory serves, there's some kind of deal about the subscription fee, and if you're already a Wii owner or something, I don't know whether it's less or more, but they just make it enticing enough to say, sure, you know, whatever, it's $4 a month, or you know, and I can watch unlimited films. Yes.
Sorry, I just demerit and limit good point and bad point. Nintendo is very popular, is very good, but something I worry about. Everybody game is real life. Example, traveling or something. Not doing, and virtual life, making virtual life, and but very convenience and good communication and good now generation. That's a good idea, but something now warming global problem or something, and mobile phone or something, it's very problem, and I think this, I worry just this one.
Okay, yeah.
Energy problem or something.
Nintendo, you know, if you go back, just because your point is really, you know, Nintendo actually introduced gaming to mobility. You know, they started with something called a Game & Watch. It's teeny, it's about that big. And in the 70s, I should say, introduced. Okay, Mattel made kind of your football game where you could kind of, you know, move a little thing around and carry it around. And I certainly played with that. But its mobility element was always based on battery power, right? Battery strength. And that's why the Game Boy was so successful to some degree, because it had a longer, you know, battery life than you know, your I think Sega options or whatever else was out there. So it's really important, and those kinds of considerations are still out there for the hardware as well. You know, I've heard about the 3D as well. One of the negatives, for, you know, is that the 3DS burns the battery out particularly quickly. I don't think you're concerned about the batteries as much as the environment, but yeah.
all the world is economy,
Yeah.
economy, Nintendo go up. All the world economy down. And why I don't know, and it's very, I wonder of it.
Sure.
Because maybe everybody game.
First thing we do, let's blame the gamers. Okay.
Jean-Marc Dole, I'm working in finance. Could you just sum up the key ingredients which account for the so long success and creativity of Nintendo, mostly the creativity, sustained over such a continuous long
Starting
period?
with 1889, or where do you want to go?
No, I don't know, but you pointed out there is no specific issue in the quality of recruitment, for instance.
Why it continues to be successful?
Yeah, why it continues to be so creative? Where do the ideas come from?
Well, again, I would love to put myself inside Nintendo, and again, I don't think the book does, but what I can say is, the way I would answer it from looking at them, I think they all have a very, and I've used this word a lot, exacting sense of what a gaming experience is worth, what it should be. And they don't, and as best they can, they won't create something that is not worth anyone's time or their money in particular. And sometimes I think, be it other companies or other industries, sometimes it's a get it out mentality. Nintendo in the 80s actually had a problem, I think, with one of their consoles once. Yamauchi, was all set for a big US rollout, and he actually looked at, you could argue this is like the Lexus story that's taught at MBA schools, but they looked at, what it would cost them to stop the rollout and address the problem, or go ahead with it. And they just said, we don't want that to be our corporate legacy. And I think similarly, they don't want to make games that aren't, are losers. I mean, there's also a lot of criticism that you come to market with a console, but you don't have enough games to support it. So invariably, there's going to be something that's a bit more marginal, and from a gamer perspective, is reviewed poorly. But I think the way they have offset this over the last decade is create so many diverse experiences of what is gaming that it has allowed people to kind of enter the gaming space without having to know Miyamoto is always very clear about, I don't want people to pick this up and kind of have to sit there and ponder. It should be quite inviting, and you can get into it reasonably quickly. The rules and the actual dynamics of the console are quite easy to operate, and the software itself quite easy to use. I hope I answered your question, but let's just say ease of use and compelling content. Well, thank you very much, man. Thank you. And some of the books available. Books are, thanks again, hot and ready to go.